There we go.
Hi, Mike. How are things? Can you hear me?
I can, George. Yeah, sorry about being late.
Great. Yeah.
So I'll just good. A bit harder. There you go.
Okay, let's see that light. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is George Chow, and I'm the MLA for Vancouver Fraserville, and also the chair of the Special Committee to review provision of the Public Service Act. I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the Legislative Precinct in Victoria, which is located on the territory of the Algonquin-speaking peoples, also known as the Songhe and Esquimalt nations. I'd like to ask everyone else to consider the lands which they're on, where they live, work, and play. So this committee is reviewing the provision of the Public Service Act relating to dismissal process reviews by the Merit Commissioner. Today, we'll be receiving briefings from the Office of the Ombudsperson, the British Columbia Excluded Employee Association, and the Ministry of the Attorney General. Before we get started, we have a round of introduction by members on the committee, starting with Mike on my left. Yeah.
Mike DeYoung from Abbotsford West.
Rolly Russell, Boundary South Okanagan Small Community.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Harvinder Sandhu, MLA from Vernon Monashi.
And members online? Yeah. Mike?
Mike
Yeah.
Morse, Prince George Mackenzie. Thank you.
Morning, Nicholas Simons, Powell River Sunshine Coast. Good morning, everyone.
Okay, thank you. And so I'm really glad to welcome our first guest from the Office of the Ombudsperson. And you have 20 minutes, Ombudsperson, for your presentation. And after that, we'll have questions from the committee members. So let's start. Thank you. And of course, I also like to welcome the Director of Public Reporting, Policy and Knowledge Management from the Office of the Ombudsperson, Zoe Jackson. And of course, the Ombudsperson, Jay Chalk.
Great.
Welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Deputy Chair, honourable members of the committee. As the Chair mentioned, I'm Jay Chalk. I'm British Columbia's Ombudsperson, and with me is Zoe Jackson, our office's Director of Planning, Policy and Public Reporting. And before I start, just like to reiterate the Chair's acknowledgement of gathering on Lekwungen territory. Our office, which is just located a few blocks from here, is also on that same territory, and I always acknowledge their stewardship of the land that we're fortunate to have our office on. But of course, having province-wide jurisdiction, our work extends across the homelands of many First Nations and Métis chartered communities across the province, and we acknowledge them as well. So, as the committee members heard last night, I believe, the provisions of the Public Service Act that are under review by this committee were the result of amendments that were made following a recommendation in my office's 2017 report, Misfire, the Ministry of Health, Employment Terminations and Related Matters. My aim in this appearance is to provide the committee with the background and context underlying that recommendation for consideration. It's my submission that the provisions serve an important oversight function and that they should continue in force. I make no recommendations for change to the provisions themselves, but happy to answer any questions you might have. In 2015, the Select Standing Committee on Finance and Government Services, I think in this very room, tasked my office with investigating the 2012 for-cause terminations of a number of Ministry of Health employees, as well as a number of other matters that were related to those terminations. We conducted an almost 2-year investigation that involved the review of over 4 million documentary records, involved interviewing 130 witnesses who provided over 500 hours of evidence under oath. Our investigation found that flawed investigations and rushed decision-making resulted in key government officials taking actions that had far-reaching and harmful consequences. Key decision-makers acted on incorrect information from a ministry investigation team and wrongly believed that the conduct of the employees under investigation was sufficient to support dismissals for cause. This happened because the human resource process effectively collapsed under a rushed process and confusion about the scope of legal advice that had been provided. Many government controls and practices were not followed, and ultimately I concluded that the terminations were unjustified. As a result of these findings, my report made a number of systemic recommendations aimed at strengthening BC's public service, including its human resource policies, processes, and decision-making related to just cause dismissals. I recommended that the Public Service Agency establish clear lines of responsibility for human resource investigations so that senior executives can ensure that any internal investigation occurring under their leadership is conducted in accordance with the principles of administrative fairness, has a clearly articulated scope and focus, and has appropriate lines of reporting. I recommended that the PSA take steps to ensure that its policies reflected an administratively fair and just investigative process. I recommended that the PSA cease its practice of suspending excluded management employees without pay pending an investigation into alleged misconduct, and I recommended that the PSA develop policy to ensure that legal opinions are received and appropriately considered as part of the just cause dismissal process. And those recommendations you can find at recommendation 19, 20, 25, and 26 of our 2017 report. Over the years following the 2017 release of our report, we monitored government's implementation of our 41 recommendations, all of which it had accepted. In our 2022 follow-up report to review government's subsequent actions on the 41 recommendations, I assessed all of those recommendations as fully implemented. Building on those recommendations, and most relevant to this committee, is Misfire's recommendation 27, which I'll read in full. By March 31, 2018, government introduced legislation for consideration by the Legislative Assembly to amend the Public Service Act to provide the Merit Commissioner with the authority to A, conduct reviews of all public service dismissals for just cause, to ensure adherence to public service standards and legal requirements. Such reviews are to take place following the completion of all labor relations or litigation proceedings related to the termination. B, publicly report the results of these reviews along with whatever recommendations the Merit Commissioner considers appropriate in the circumstances. I made this recommendation because, given my findings in Misfire, I felt that the public service would benefit from a process of regular oversight of dismissal practices aimed at identifying systemic issues and recommending improvements. This would be an after-the-fact compliance assessment of whether public bodies subject to the Public Service Act had complied with the legal and policy requirements in respect of a just cause dismissal. Legislative amendments that reflected this recommendation were introduced in the House on April 10, 2018. The bill received royal assent on May 17 and came into effect that same day. I want to speak further about three key aspects of my recommendation: that the oversight be embedded in legislation, that the oversight be carried out by the Merit Commissioner, and that the Merit Commissioner report publicly on their office's reviews. It was important that this oversight be embedded in legislation because the deterrent effect it creates would, in my view, significantly decrease the likelihood of events such as those we describe in Misfire from recurring. Furthermore, having this in legislation ensures some longevity. At the time my report was released, government made a clear commitment to implement the human resource practice changes we had recommended. Unfortunately, as we know, memories fade over time, policies and personnel change, and good practices can inadvertently erode. By establishing a legislative foundation for oversight, the Legislative Assembly has created an important bulwark against that tendency to forget the lessons of the past. There are not many dismissals for cause in the public service. However, they are highly consequential for the people involved, and it is essential that the investigation and decision-making process be carried out with scrupulous attention to fairness. This oversight, I want to emphasize, is as much about promoting a culture in which the relevant policies and practices have been appropriately followed as it is about finding problems. It's also clear that the nature of the oversight matters. I recommended that the Merit Commissioner take on this role because impartiality and objectivity is essential to carrying out this oversight function. The Merit Commissioner has existing expertise and knowledge of best practices in public service human resource processes, but is independent from the PSA by virtue of its status as an independent officer of the Legislative Assembly. Because it is structurally separate from any decision-making process, the Merit Commissioner is well placed to offer impartial and meaningful advice on dismissal best practices. The Act provided that the dismissal review by the Merit Commissioner only applied to dismissals that occurred on or after April 1st, 2018, and a dismissal only becomes eligible for review after 12 months or 6 months after all grievance proceedings or court or other proceedings have concluded. As I gather that you heard from the Merit Commissioner last night, it's understandably took a while for those post facto reviews to get to that office, given that it only occurs after all relevant legal proceedings are completed. While the Commissioner's reviews have not, to date, found many instances of significant non-compliance, the Commissioner has nonetheless identified important practice issues for improvement. In my view, there's real value in the independent feedback on the dismissal process that the Merit Commissioner provides, even absent findings of non-compliance, as it ensures ongoing attention to the process. My recommendation also emphasized public reporting on the outcomes of dismissal reviews. Consistent with this, the Merit Commissioner has begun reporting on the reviews that the office has completed as part of its annual report. Such reporting provides an important mechanism for public accountability and transparency. It recognizes that all British Columbians have an interest in ensuring that public servants, whose work is of vital importance to everyone in this province, are treated fairly. Thus, even though it's been 5 years since the amendments came into force, it's still early days for these amendments. And many senior public administrators who were around when our report came out are still around, so it remains top of mind. But time marches on, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, memories fade. So the statutory entrenchment of these reviews is an important counterweight to the fading memories about the damage poorly administered just cause dismissals can cause. So I urge you to recommend that the provision remain in force. With that, Zoe and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. And, question from members? Mike and Rolly?
Thanks, folks. A couple of questions. Yesterday, we had a conversation as members of the committee about the underlying rationale for the recommendation that was ultimately acted upon, leading to the legislative amendment to have the Merit Commissioner review just cause dismissals, and it was restricted to just cause dismissals. Was that largely the product of the fact that the report, the misfire report, was dealing with just cause dismissals?
Yeah, so certainly our recommendation was limited to just cause dismissals. I had occasion in preparation for this appearance to go over and read again exactly what we had recommended in misfire, and it was limited to just cause dismissals. In terms of the legislation, that was really up to government to draft, so ultimately in their bailiwick. But certainly the situation that confronted us in the investigation we conducted was entirely related to just cause dismissals, and obviously those are the ones where individuals aren't necessarily receiving any compensation as a result of any sort of settlement if the employer believes that the matter is, is for just cause. So they're the most disadvantageous to a former employee, if I can put it that way, or to a terminated employee. And that was the situation we faced.
Just two more questions. Since then, let's say since 2015, has your office received requests? They might be from individuals. I don't think your office has received a request from government, but have you received applications or requests from other public service employees to review either a just cause dismissal or another process that has led to the loss of employment in the public service?
So I think that when a public servant or any employee of any of the 1,000 public bodies that are under our jurisdiction would make a complaint to us, or I think we would first encourage that person to pursue the remedies that are available to them through their union grievance process if they're an included employee. Other possibilities include the Employment Standards Branch or the Human Rights Tribunal, whatever the case may be. We generally don't investigate employment-related complaints. Of course, the misfire was one where we were directed to by a committee of this House. But as it relates to offices, my other mandate under the Public Interest Disclosure Act may have a role in, we may have a role in that context for reviewing dismissals under that act, because the act specifically mandates us to investigate allegations of reprisal where someone has blown the whistle or disclosed wrongdoing for their employer. So that's a possibility under that act. But it's not a, generally speaking, we would make referrals to other remedies that people have, because they do have most public sector employees have other remedies, particularly in the non-cause context.
Understood. I was merely trying to get a sense of to what extent, if at all, employees, past or present, were making application to the office. You've indicated how you would direct them and what their, but whether or not there is a you're sensing or experiencing a level of request.
Yeah, we get 8,000 people turning to us each year, and for sure there are some people in that group who are employees who have some grievance, for sure.
Okay, thank you. Rolly?
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. I have two questions. The first of which is similar, so and I don't have all the appropriate language, so excuse me on that. But part of this conversation, I think, also is to do with the focus is on the procedural fairness to get to an endpoint. Do you have a sense of whether the fairness to get to the decision point of a just cause versus without cause dismissal is worth attention, or is that a procedural point that there have been issues that you envision might be problematic?
So we did in the situation that we that resulted in misfire, we noted that there were failings in the human resource processes that existed at the time, and as so different recommendations than the ones that resulted in independent oversight of that practice. We also recommended improvements in the human resource practices that attach to making a decision to terminate someone's employment for cause. So those are other policies, and it is those policies that form part of what it is that the Merit Commissioner then assesses whether those have been complied with. So there are specific policies that do address terminations. Those have come about because of the recommendations that we made in misfire elsewhere. So adhering to those is what the Merit Commissioner is really trying to do.
Second question, more aligned with that, is what we heard yesterday from the PSA was a commentary on the resource burden of preparing the documentation for all dismissals for just cause. And their suggestion was twofold, or their recommendation, one of which was to identify a subset of information as opposed to the entirety of all of the documentation for those dismissals. And the other was a random or some kind of sample of those dismissals as opposed to the entire reviewing all of those dismissals. given your initial, the work of your office and the recommendations there, how would those recommendations fit within the context of, or those recommendations from the PSA fit within the context of your sense of the original intention?
We certainly recommended all and so that's certainly from our perspective at the time that it's such a low volume of cases that there's no reason not to review them all. We hadn't anticipated I think you heard last night, the 315 that related to during the pandemic. And so there may be special case one can make around that. My understanding is that the legislation does afford the Merit Commissioner some ability to select the cases. But my view, it should be all. As for the question of the administrative burden, certainly, one of the things that I gather that the Merit Commissioner suggested to this committee last night was around this question of, and I think it also came from PSA, that not the suggestion, but the description of the administrative problem came from PSA, was having to go through and identify privileged information. Certainly, it seems to me, and we in Misfire were able to obtain all the privileged information as part of the records that we demanded, and we got all that, notwithstanding any existence of any privilege. It seems to me that that's reasonable for another officer of the legislature to receive as well. Government has an interest, of course, in ensuring that the information that it might transmit to an independent officer doesn't trigger what's called waiver of privilege. And I believe that the Merit Commissioner has suggested to you that would be an appropriate amendment to provide, or for you to suggest to government to provide that transmittal of privileged information to the Merit Commissioner does not trigger waiver as against third parties. That feels very much to me like a useful thing in order to provide additional assurance to government, but it's also I would say, just when one thinks about the actual factual circumstances that result in these reviews, or when these reviews occur, pretty remote possibility anyway, because the entire exercise happens after all the legal proceedings are over. So at that point, there's unlikely to be a significant interest in the records anyway. But if, in order to provide government with assurance that they're not prejudicing their own legal position by transmitting that information to the Merit Commissioner, if it was provided that providing that information to the Merit Commissioner does not waive government's whatever privilege they might have vis-a-vis a third party, that remains in force, that would allow the Merit Commissioner to do their job. It would relieve the administrative burden that the Public Service Agency is describing, and it would continue to protect government's legal interests.
Thank you. One follow-up, please. So to that last point, you had mentioned earlier about the fact that part of the intention here is the change in the culture as well as the kind of content focus and identifying individual outcomes. If you were to make recommendations at this point about the most effective or efficient ways to reduce some of the administrative burden, regardless of what that is at this point, and still maintain that, again, that intention of changing the culture and making sure there is some oversight. Do you have any suggestions, or what would be your top suggestions in terms of achieving that?
It would be to maintain the oversight of the Merit Commissioner to determine what records to obtain, what matters to investigate, and it would be to relieve the administrative burden on the PSA by providing that disclosure of privileged information to the Merit Commissioner doesn't constitute a waiver, so government doesn't lose whatever privilege rights they have, and the Merit Commissioner can do their job, and the public can have confidence that the Merit Commissioner has had access to all the information that they need. Because if the entity that's being reviewed is the one that's selecting which records they get or which matters to be reviewed, it's hard for the public to have that confidence. So I think that one has to put confidence in, and I'm another officer of the legislature, so I'm saying that, but one has to have confidence in The work of an officer, well, they're carefully selected by members of this House. They're charged with conducting statutory obligations. They're highly scrutinized, but at the end of the day, you have to have some confidence that they're going to do that job properly, and you have to give them the tools so that the public then has confidence in the outcome. If you put too many restrictions on what they can do and see, then the whole notion that you've created public confidence disappears.
Okay, one more. Thank you. My background is in science, not in law. And in that world, we don't ever normally have the ability to sample everything. And the entirety of the work is to determine how do you do an effective job with a partial sample. And so while I appreciate what you're saying, it seems like there ought to also be an approach that we could take that without restrictions on potential access, take a sample in some way that would be an effective representation and provide that public assurance still that the system is with appropriate oversight.
For sure. And I think, for example, at the front end, at the hiring end, where there are thousands and thousands of people hired, you do see that in the work of the merit commissioner. They select a random sample of hiring matters in order to assess whether or not at the front end people have been hired in accordance with the principle of merit. At the back end, we're talking, I think the number I heard was 17 cases last year, or something in that range. I think they've looked at 45 over the entire 5 years. So very small numbers. So I'm not, I don't know as a scientist whether that would be small enough that you could do all the cases. But even if it's not, the critical thing is that the discretion to determine how to select the cases rests with the merit commissioner. That rather than have this committee or the government set out rules about what cases to see and what records to see, that discretion rests ultimately with the merit commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Ombudsperson, and thank you for giving us a recap of what happened, since you come out with the report in 2017. Now, out of those 40 recommendations, you said every single one was recommended and was carried out?
That's correct. I'd like to turn it over to Zoe to talk about the monitoring we did. We did 2 reports assessing it. I'll turn it over to Zoe. Say a few words.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So we and government committed immediately after our report came out to implement those recommendations, and we engaged in a quite robust follow-up process where we received information from government on each of the recommendations, reviewed that information carefully. We did an interim report and a final report last year in 2022, where we were able to conclude that all recommendations had been implemented.
So out of those recommendations, are there that kind of border on human resources practice of the PSA that need to be kind of reviewed and looked at?
So I think I mentioned a few of them in my remarks. I go back and see the numbers. So if you look at recommendation 19, 20, 25, and 26. Mm-hmm. So we recommended, and that was really about having investigations that are conducted in accordance with the principles of administrative fairness, clearly articulated scope and focus, and have appropriate lines of reporting. We also recommended that there had been an earlier review in 2014, and as a result, we suggested that there be a compliance review done, because there were some other human resource suggestions that had been made in 2014. So in order to ensure whether or not those were being complied with, we recommended a subsequent review be conducted. And I think that was alluded to in the slides from the PSA last night. There were 2 other reviews conducted by Marcy McNeil and Corinne Bell. Oh, and then we made recommendations about legal advice and to ensure that dismissals for cause were only conducted following obtaining of legal advice and a good understanding of what that legal advice was, because there was at least some confusion over the scope of the legal advice that had been sought and provided in the matters that we investigated in our investigation, and so a much more structured process for obtaining legal advice. So those are all, and those are the things basically that the merit commissioner has to assess when they're assessing whether or not termination took place in accordance with all of those rules.
So when you talk about legal advice, you're talking about the PSA seeking legal advice on that particular case, correct? Correct.
So
Okay.
recommendation 25, at page 377 of our report. In relation to excluded employees, the PSA obtain a written legal opinion about whether there are sufficient grounds to support the termination. The PSA should provide its lawyer with sufficient background and file material for the lawyer to assess the evidentiary strength of the government's just cause position. And then in relation to included employees, people in the bargaining unit, the PSA obtained written senior labor relations advice about the strength of government's just cause position from one of its senior labor relations advisors. The PSA should provide its advisor sufficient background and file material for the advisor to assess the evidentiary strength of the government's just cause position. And C, the deputy minister with authority to dismiss, because those are line deputy ministers as opposed to the PSA, the deputy minister with authority to dismiss be required to review and consider the PSA's advice and the legal advice prior to making a decision about whether to terminate an employee for cause. Such consideration should be confirmed in writing.
Okay, thank you. That's a must read for us, 41 recommendations.
It's a long report.
Yeah, thank you. So that concludes our questions. Deputy Chair Morris, you got any further comments that you'd like to make?
No, as usual, Jay, you sum it up quite good. A lot of information there, and it was very clear, so thanks very much.
Okay, thanks both of you, and we can conclude this part and take a recess until 10 o'clock, which is when the next presentation. So Good morning, members and guests. Welcome to the Legislative Building, which is on the unceded territory of the Algonquin-speaking people, also known as the Shawnee and Esquimalt nations. And I'd like to thank the delegation, who have 4 members to come forward to the committee. And I'm George Chow. I'm the chair of the committee, and we would go around and have a introduction by our members, starting with the deputy chair, who's online, Mike Morris. Mike?
Good morning still. Mike Morris, MLA for Prince George Mackenzie.
And another member on the screen?
Good morning, everyone. Nicholas Simons, MLA for Powell River Sunshine Coast.
Rolly? Yeah.
Russell, I'm the MLA for the South Okanagan, Boundary, and Smokemean.
And Mr. Dion?
I'm still Mike DeYoung from Abbotsford West.
Okay, we also have another member, but she'll be joining us. And I'd like to welcome the members from the British Columbia Excluded Employee Association, and the president, Francis Sasvari, and the executive director, Liz Gillian, and the director, Alistair Cochran, and the advisor, Selena Liu. Welcome. And we also have our member who, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. I'm Harvinder Sandhu, MLA from Vernon Monashi. Sorry, during break I was trying to do some constituency work.
Yes, we understand. So for your presentation, you have 20 minutes. Unlike some of our members in the chamber, they could go on forever, but you only have 20 minutes here. And after that, we'll ask questions. So yes, please.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you very much for allowing us to present today to the special committee. We'll start with a bit of a snapshot of who we are, because not everyone knows who we are. So we are the BC Excluded Employees Association. So for the rest of this presentation, I'll refer to the BC EAA, just to make it short so we can keep to our 20 minutes. So a little bit about who we are. So the BC EAA, we are a nonprofit, and we are completely funded through membership dues. Our primary members are BC government non-unionized public servants, and membership is voluntary in our organization. So we've been around for quite a while. We were originally established in July of 1979 by a government-appointed management advisory committee for the purpose of providing a unified and credible voice for excluded employees in respect to personnel policies and benefits. So our services that we provide non-biased or unbiased and relevant services to our non-unionized employees in the BC Public Service. People contact us for service primarily because they are experiencing some sort of difficulty in the workplace. We are a resource that is trusted by our members. We're dedicated to supporting their workplace success through advice, support, coaching, training, and bringing issues of importance to them to the attention of senior management. So one of the things that we do, of course, and which is probably most relevant for today, is our role in investigations. So in one of our roles, we are referred employees who are involved in workplace investigations by the PSA, also by ministry staff and other BC EAA members. So the results of the investigations in which we are involved in can range from allegations, of course, being completely unfounded, to getting notes of discipline for our employees or letters of expectations, demotions and dismissals with and without cause, so a wide range, of course. And during investigations, our role is to advise and support the employees, and we have folks who do that who are contracted with us who assist with that work. So a little bit of context about today. So our comments and recommendations that we're going to talk about today are solely specific to the experience of our excluded employees. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the current review process, and then we'll move to future looking and some potential recommendations and thoughts that we have as the board. But with regards to the current review process, first of all, again, we want to thank the Merit Commissioner's Office for taking the time to outline in detail the materials they received from the BC Public Service Agency on which they base their dismissal review. It is our opinion that the breadth and depth of these materials provide sufficient information to conduct a comprehensive review and to make meaningful recommendations. In addition, the Merit Commissioner's annual reports makes findings and recommendations that align with our experience and observations throughout the entire investigation process, which to us is another indication that the dismissal process review is actually sound. To ensure ample information is provided to the Merit Commissioner in conducting her reviews where possible, we do hope that the Commissioner can continue to review all eligible dismissals in the future. So I want to recognize the improvements made to the workplace investigations process by the PSA since the release, of course, of the misfire report, which was the start of much of this. These kind of changes, they're super easy to talk about. We know how hard they are to actually implement, so we do want to commend that work that's been done to date. In the next section of our presentation, we're going to look forward. We're going to look forward and focus on various aspects of the investigation process raised by the Merit Commissioner in the hopes that our information will contribute to the ongoing improvement of the processes related to workplace investigations, a portion of which actually do, of course, result in dismissal. So that being said, I'll turn it over to the person who actually knows a whole bunch, so Liz Gilliland, our Executive Director.
Thanks, Frances. So we decided to take a random sample of investigations that we've been involved with. And by the way, over the period of time since the Merit Commissioner has conducted her reviews, we've been involved with 284 investigations. So our experience is robust. And we understand what goes on because we accompany the person into investigation interviews. We help them prepare for interviews. We help them submit additional material after interviews. And then we stick with the person right through to the findings and any discipline or after action that happens. So we're an end-to-end service, if you think about it that way. So we note that the Merit Commissioner in her last report made reference to timeliness related to investigations. And that struck a chord with us because when you look at the PowerPoint that we sent in and the report, you can see that there's some examples of the longevity of the processes of these investigations. And we recognize that investigations are complex. They involve multiple parties sometimes. They involve numerous handoffs in the process, and I can talk about those in detail later if you have questions. But, there's many exchanges of information and handoffs before any result actually gets communicated to the employee, and there's many good reasons for that. We understand that there's very serious end results to any of these investigations. As you know, you're here to look at dismissals. That's one of the serious implications. So we understand that it's important to take the time to do due diligence, to be careful, because the repercussions, most of what we see are disciplinary in nature. The vast minority end in dismissals, which is what you're looking at. But we appreciate that takes time and that takes effort. So I don't need to go through the numbers. You can see them. You can see them for yourselves. But it's become clear that when you look at these delays, that it has a serious impact on the people involved, whether you're the subject of the investigation or the complainant who has initiated the investigation. An accompanying factor that causes undue strain on people going through these processes is the lack of communication that occurs throughout the process. So you can be informed that you're the subject of a set of allegations. It might be quite a while, maybe 2-3 months before you're interviewed. In that interim period, you're not receiving any information, or rarely receiving any information. Then you get an interview. You go through that with the investigator, and then you don't know what happens if you're not re-interviewed. You have no idea what's going on. And as you know from looking at the previous slide, some of those delays are very long. And this lack of communication puts incredible stress on people. If you've looked at the research on stress and resilience, which I'm sure would be good if you did for your own well-being, the fear of the unknown, when it's a serious implication, our brain sees that as a bigger threat than bad news. And so you can imagine the strain that it puts on someone to go through a period of, a long extended period of not understanding what's happening in the process of an investigation. So of the cases that we reviewed, those 34 cases, 18% reported seeking medical attention as a result of the strain they were under from the length and the lack of communication, and an additional 14.7% talked to their advisor that was with them about the strain and the stress and the problems that was creating at home with their families, but they didn't seek medical attention. So when you look at those stats, those are profound impacts, and I think they're underreported because many people that go through an investigation aren't comfortable for some reason letting people know that they're going for even their advisor, that they're going for counseling or they've seen a doctor. The other big impact of the length and the lack of communication is that people begin to feel alienated from their peers and their employees in the workplace. You're not allowed to talk. There's good reasons for that, but you don't want to discuss confidential aspects when you're involved in an investigation for multiple reasons. Collusion, privacy, you name it. There's countless reasons. However, that puts you in this sort of stultified environment where there's conversations you just can't participate in at work. And it creates a feeling of being separated from everyone. And on top of that, if allegations have been made about me as a supervisor by a direct report, it's inappropriate for us to continue to interact in the workplace together. And you might think, well, working from home solves that problem, but no, you're still involved in meetings, you're still involved in performance reviews, you're still interacting with that person all the time. So generally what happens, again for a good reason, is you're separated, and most often it's the senior person that's excluded. So they're relieved from their regular duties. Sometimes they're handed other duties, sometimes they're on leave with pay, which sounds like a holiday, but it isn't if you're worried that you're going to lose your job or you're going to be dismissed and that you're not getting information. And the longer that period goes, the more everyone knows that you're not away for fun. You're away because you're the subject of something very serious. And there's reputational damage that occurs that is sometimes, if you aren't dismissed, it's sometimes impossible to repair that damage. So in many of those instances, even if the allegations are proven to be unfounded, the person can't work in that workplace any longer. So there is a slide there with some quotes because it's very easy to feel a great distance from what we're talking about. But I thought it was important to put real life examples in the presentation so that you could understand the struggle that it puts people under. And the reputational damage, I can think of one instance where someone was in a very responsible portfolio, they were senior, the allegations against them were unfounded except for 2 minor allegations. But because of the length of the investigation and the awareness of everyone around them, they could no longer work there. So it was a disappointment to the deputy and to them that they had to leave and go and work in another organization. So, sometimes these situations are unavoidable, but if we're going to put people in this situation, we should make sure that it's necessary rather than just a result of the process. So our recommendation on this regard, we think that there's enough examples of delays that we would like to see the Office of the Merit Commissioner undertake an analytical look at this. The commissioner has sufficient information to be able to spot the timelines all the way through. So where are these delays happening? What entity or branch are the delays occurring in? Is there any way we can improve the process so that as people go through this process, whether they're dismissed or not, that the impact isn't making them ill, the impact of going through the process isn't affecting their well-being. We would also like to recommend that there be a transparent process, much like in civil or criminal court, where the accused knows exactly what's happening, knows what happens next, knows what's happened what's going to happen 3 steps from now. Is the jury deliberating, or are they requesting more information? Whether it's civil or criminal, the person is aware and updated. And what we've learned in coaching people who are in situations where they can't get a result soon of a difficult situation, we have learned, and the literature proves that you can create a sense of certainty by providing details along the way rather than nothing. You might not be able to get people to the end faster, but if you can map their route on the way, it gives them a sense of they're not completely out of control. So we would really think these 2 recommendations would go a long distance to improving the process. The other issue that the Merit Commissioner raised in her 22-23 report, or that's what I'm calling it, her last report, she noted that there made a reference to medical issues. And for us, there are 2 aspects to the topic of medical issues. One is, what was the medical issue that perhaps precipitated the very behavior that is being investigated? What did they have a diagnosed mental health condition, and what was that? And that's important, not because it excuses a behavior, but it might mitigate whatever the result is at the end. So, if your behavior is being caused because you're suffering from PTSD, or you're being diagnosed with anxiety disorder, then the behavior shouldn't continue that damages the workplace and damages people in the workplace, but the end result, whether it's dismissal or whether it's discipline of some kind, might be looked at in a very different way. And I believe that there's more recognition of something as well known as PTSD now, but I don't see the same kind of understanding from an investigator's viewpoint or from a ministry's viewpoint when they discuss the behavior of an employee who might be diagnosed with anxiety or other mental health disorders. So I'm pleased to see that the Public Service Agency is starting to do more training in that regard, but I honestly believe that investigators really should have a better grasp of that. The other aspect of the medical is what we've talked about is the process itself damaging people? Is there a better way to get to a correct end result, an accurate result, without people having to suffer unduly along the way? So what we would like to recommend is that there's confirmation from the Public Service Agency and of the Ministry that medical issues are considered through the investigation process and factored into the dismissal decision. And that when medical issues are a factor, that's incorporated into the report that goes to the decision maker in the ministry that is making the decision about, with the Public Service Agency's advice, of course, of what disciplinary action should take place, whether it's dismissal or not. And lastly, that the PSA or the Merit Commissioner's Office undertake a review to assess how the investigation process can be improved to minimize the negative impact on the mental health and emotional well-being of employees who are involved with these processes. Lastly, I'm sure you'll be happy to know, the other issue that the Merit Commissioner did mention about it in her previous report was the issue of witnesses. Now, as you know, in an investigation, if I have allegations made against me, broad brushstrokes are no longer good enough since the misfire report. So it's not good enough to say that you've bullied me or that this person has humiliated me. What we look at now are instances. So what were the behavioral instances that happened that support that broad brush allegation? And for the investigator, having been given a list of incidences by the complainant potentially, the investigator's job is, can I corroborate this? How can I go about that? And of course, one of the ways you go about that is by checking with witnesses. Who overheard you? Who overheard the person shouting? Who witnessed the person's being criticized in a damaging way in front of peers, who witnessed the Zoom call or the Teams call. We've heard initially anecdotally from our members that they found out afterwards that witnesses had not been contacted, those names that they'd put forward. And you're not allowed to discuss investigations, but I'll give you an example of how people discover this without breaking the rules. Is someone was worried about a reference because they competed for a job and they had given the names of a couple of witnesses. So they actually went to one of them and said, I just need to know in advance how you plan to handle this reference, considering the investigation. And the witness had never been called and said, I don't know what you're talking about. And so the workplace it's very permeous. Is that the word? Information, just people know. And so the issue of witnesses not being called gives a person a sense that it's unfair, that they've been part of an unfair process. That might not necessarily have been the case, but because they are offered no explanation for why witnesses weren't called, because they weren't informed, all they're left with is a sense that the employer is now treating them unfairly. And the results of that, as we all know, is a lack of discretionary effort in the workplace, et cetera, et cetera. We know the damage from that. So what we would like to recommend, I'm just going to my slide, is to confirm that witnesses that are being put forward by the whoever is involved, whether it's the complainant or the subject, are being interviewed, and if they're not, that the person is given a reason why their witnesses aren't being interviewed. There might be very legitimate reasons that they're given that. And if witnesses aren't being interviewed, that information is also included in the final report so that the decision maker understands. And I think that's the end of my section. I'll hand it back over to Frances. Thanks, Frances.
Kudos to my colleague with 26 seconds to spare. So just again, want to thank you for allowing us to present to you today, and we are certainly open for any questions you may have.
Yes, question from members? Yeah, Mike?
Well, I'm glad you came, because, and this in no way disparages anyone, but everyone else every other agency we've heard from thus far has had a role in the investigative process or reviewing the investigative process. You are the first group that has been able to bring us some information from the perspective of the person being investigated, and I think that's an important dimension to this, especially when we consider the circumstances that gave rise to the legislative provisions that we're actually here to review. The three recommendations you've included in your material. The one that I had a little bit of a question about was the second one, relating to the taking into account of medical circumstances, but you kind of clarified that in what you really mean is, to the extent that a medical condition may have contributed to the behavior that is the subject of the investigation, you are suggesting that should be factored into the decision, the review, and the ultimate decision. And that, if I'm understanding that correctly, that makes sense. With respect to your third recommendation, any thoughts? I mean, 100 years ago, when I practiced law and did criminal defense work and prosecution work, I mean, you're quite right. The law there has evolved. An accused person knows a hell of a lot about what the accusation is, what the evidence around the accusation is. Here we are talking about, for most people, the most serious kind of allegation they will ever face, with the most serious ramifications of all, the loss of their livelihood. So this notion that a person would say, look, investigator, here are some people with relevant information to this matter that I think you should be speaking with, that may not happen, would from anyone's point of view, but certainly from the perspective of the subject of the investigation, be very troubling. How do we actually, to the extent that we are going to wrestle with making some recommendations around the role of the merit commissioner and the review, I mean, how do we functionally do that? How do you establish with some measure of certainty that witnesses who are identified by, I'm going to use the term the accused, but the subject of the investigation, how do we ensure that those people are at least contacted? Now, the investigator may decide that the information is irrelevant, is not accurate, but how do we at least establish that the witness was contacted?
Well, the merit commissioner, that was one of the things that we were concerned about as well. How do you do that magically? But when you look at the material the merit commissioner gets, she gets all the transcripts from the interviews, so that information is in there. If, you know, when we're going in as an advisor with someone, we make sure that they understand if you have witnesses to certain allegations, you need to put them forward, and if they forget, we remind them. So that's in the record. So it's part of the record that they have witnesses that they've named, whether they're the complainant or the subject, actually, either way. So the merit commissioner's office does have access to that information. And also every email associated with an investigation, that's all handed over to her as well. So the merit commissioner's office should be able to follow up on that.
In that flow of information between the investigative branch and the person who's the subject of the investigation, is there merit in at the end of that exercise, when a decision is rendered, providing and let's assume for the purpose of this conversation the decision is dismissal. Is there merit in including in the record, providing the person who has now been dismissed or about to be dismissed or is dismissed, an opportunity to at least place on the record any concerns they would have around the procedure that was followed, so that when if the file goes to the merit commissioner, there is a document that says the former employee, dismissed employee, has expressed a concern that this person or these people who they identified as a relevant witness were never contacted.
Well, I might have to get Selena to help answer the second part of that, of the answer. One of the ways that can be done, and if I'm accompanying a person into an investigation, I can call a break and I can say to the person, can you express your concerns about whatever the process issues are, and help them write enough notes so that they, even if they're nervous, they can go back in the room and outline what their concerns are. So that gets it on the record there. But it's an interesting question that you've posed. If after the investigation is complete, is there a way for the no longer employee to get something like that on their record?
The reason I ask it is one of the things we've heard from the merit commissioner and from the public service agency is the volume of documentation that gets dumped. And so we then in a review process have to rely on people who have these big files to find some kind of a summary document from the perspective of the former employee that says, here is where I believe there were some shortcomings.
You're on.
So yes, we do acknowledge there's a huge amount of documentation that goes forward, but there's nothing that we're aware of that it is documented exactly which witnesses were excluded. And there may be very good reason. If there was some kind of incident, perhaps in a meeting where 30 people were present, there would probably be very little reason that you'd have to interview, every individual who was in that meeting. So it could be as simple as the interviewee saying, you should talk to X, Y, and Z. The investigator determines that, they only need to talk to X and Y. But there should be some, from our perspective, some indication that Z was excluded as X and Y were actually spoken to. And that should be documented as part of the file. There is a termination policy that exists in the public service where there's a summary of how an investigation should be conducted, and there's a couple of checklists which actually must go forward in the deputy minister's package. And one of those is the investigator's acknowledgement, and I believe there's 10 points. And one of the questions is, were all relevant witnesses interviewed? So it could be, and it's just something, that comes to mind, perhaps in that question on the checklist, there be a little bit more detail or some acknowledgement that witnesses which were considered relevant were interviewed, and additional information provided for those that were determined to be not relevant for whatever reason. So I think there are a number of opportunities for government to decide how they want to document or summarize those findings, but because it's not formally documented at this point, it leaves the respondents sort of without any information.
Thank you.
Rolly?
Thank you for the presentation, and as MLA Jung mentioned, is very different from the previous presentation, so appreciate that. I think one of the things I struggle with a little bit is a lot of what you are referring to is the investigation on and the potential disciplinary action taken, which one potential outcome, presumably in one of the low frequency endpoints there, is dismissal with just cause. The merit commissioner's scope, as I understand it, the legislation frames that around appointments and only that one endpoint. So only dismissals with just cause. And so disciplinary action is, as I understand it, is outside of scope of the merit commissioner currently. And so the piece that you're describing, for example, around identified witnesses that were not called, that would be included in the review of that file if it results in a dismissal without cause or with just cause. But otherwise, we would not have any oversight on that process via the merit commissioner. So is your request really here to say you are wishing for a very different scope for the merit commissioner to include other elements of the process than what it currently does?
We're not considering that, but I think what we're saying is that the investigative process, whether it ends in dismissal or discipline, is the same, and that the concerns that we're raising are concerns that the Merit Commissioner herself has noted, not in the kind of detail we have, related to the investigations that she conducted regarding the dismissals. So we're happy to focus on dismissals, and I think happy to keep the scope of the Merit Commissioner where it is.
Okay. Then correct me if I'm wrong. The current scope of the Merit Commissioner, and for the purposes of this conversation, those that focus on just cause dismissals and the requirement that all available information is provided on that file is provided to the Merit Commissioner. Would that not already then include the opportunity to review medical information, to review timelines, and to review the witnesses, because they would all be in that documentation?
Yeah, that definitely, it's in the documentation, but it doesn't appear that reviewing of timelines, then an analysis of where those delays are taking place has occurred. The Merit Commissioner's report noted that there were delays, and I think, I can't remember the language that was used, but admitted that it wasn't clear why those delays were taking place. From our viewpoint, we've seen that the delays are damaging, so we're saying, yes, the information is there, let's use it to find out what the scope and scale is of this and where the delays might occur. In terms of medical issues, if an investigator is not familiar or well-versed or educated enough to understand the implications that medical conditions may have on an individual in the workplace, the fact that they might see things differently or interpret behavior differently and therefore react in ways that are inappropriate, they may not think it's significant enough to make note of it. So, I mean, I think that there are some gaps there.
Okay, and very good point, thank you. Last question, and maybe this is not something you have an answer to. I think what part of what you're identifying here, for myself at least, is we're trying to make sure the process is fair and equitable, and we are looking at one very small subset of people that have navigated through that process, and that we're restricted to that piece. Do you have a sense of, so through, you mentioned obviously or presumably the most likely outcome is disciplinary action that doesn't result in termination. And then that termination pathway, there's obviously the termination or dismissal with just cause, and there is dismissal without cause. And do you have a sense in the excluded employees group of the relative proportion of that? So we've heard clearly that there's very, relatively small numbers of cases that result in dismissal with just cause. Do you have a sense of how that compares to the group of dismissals without cause?
Yeah, I mean, I hate guessing at numbers, but
You should become finance minister.
No. I think that obviously, as you said, the minority, so that would be, I'm guessing 10% or less of the cases that we look at are dismissals for just cause. We have seen a rise, and I can't give you the exact numbers, although if it's permissible to get back with numbers, I will do so. I will take care of it.
Yes, you could send us an email on those points. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So there's been an increase in that we have noticed in dismissals without cause, and it would be interesting to look into that further. The letters sometimes look like they have cause in them for dismissals without cause, so that might be useful for future look. But the vast majority sometimes end up with no discipline, sometimes a letter of expectation, sometimes a letter of reprimand, and very rarely a move from a position to a forced move out of a position to another. But that would be the bulk of the ones that we handle for sure.
Thank you, and that information would be interesting. I feel, to state my ignorance broadly, I don't even know in order of magnitude what those ratios look like. So it would be appreciated, even ballpark. Thank you.
So I do have a question. So how large is your membership in your organization, the voluntary membership?
We're small but mighty, so we have we hover around 500 members.
Mm-hmm. So you also mentioned you looked at 284 cases. Are those including COVID cases? Where did this 284 that you mentioned come from?
The 284 are the number of investigations that we have been involved with over the period of the Merit Commissioner's review. We thought we should look at that time frame.
So over 5 years, right? The same period.
Since 2020.
Oh, since 2020. Okay.
Yeah, we only look back since 2020,
Well,
since our first report.
The Merit Commissioner had reported on 43 cases over 5 years, right? 2018 to now. So, and you also mentioned that you use sampling, random sample, because you cannot look at every case. So how do you actually do that? Maybe it's the criteria you don't want to divulge, but certainly how you actually do sampling, random.
Well,
Yeah.
for the purpose of reporting to you, we decided we didn't have the resources, quite frankly, to look at all 284 cases, so we just took a random sample. So many from here, so many from there. There really was not a lot of deep thought put into how we sampled.
So this 284 cases are for just cause?
No.
No. Okay.
They're
So
the number of investigations
the
that
investigation that you
that
did.
we've handled. And mostly, I just wanted to give you an understanding of we do know what we're talking about. We've seen this process through from end to end.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? No more questions. Thank you for your presentation, and we'll go to the next group.
Short recess.
Huh?
2-minute recess.
Yeah, 2 minutes recess. So we're good to go. Our handset technician has been waiting. She got back. Welcome and to the special committee to review provision of the Public Service Act. And I'd like to welcome two members from the Ministry Attorney General, Deputy Minister Barbara Carmichael, and Legal Counsel Denise Pritchard. And perhaps we should also introduce ourselves as committee members. I'm George Chow, a member of the MLA from Vancouver Fraserview.
Hello, I am Harvinder Sandhu, MLA from Vernon Monashee.
Yeah, Rolly Russell, MLA for Boundary, South Okanagan, Smokemean. I'm eating apples. Thank you.
Mike DeYoung from Abbotsford.
And the two members who are joining us online.
Mike Morris, MLA for Prince George Mackenzie.
And Nicholas Simons, MLA for the Sunshine Coast.
Now, we invite you to make your presentation in 20 minutes, and after that, the members will ask questions. So thank you. Go away. Yeah, take it away. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to start off by thanking you for the invitation to appear in front of you. I'm Barbara Carmichael, and I am the Deputy Attorney General. Prior to being the Deputy Attorney General, I was the Assistant Deputy Attorney General of the Legal Services Branch. And prior to that, I was a lawyer who has worked for government and the Legal Services Branch since 1997 in a variety of capacities. A couple of those capacities that are relevant to the work of this committee is I was not directly involved with the misfire incidents, but I was a solicitor advising the Ministry of Health at the relevant time. And then once the report, I was also involved with the discussions with the Ombudsperson's office about accessing information and protocols for accessing information and testimony, and testimony and privilege issues while they were working on the report. And then after the report came out, I was involved with providing legal advice, among others, on the implementation of all of the recommendations, including the ones that we're discussing that are relevant today. So I wanted to start with that background. Do you have the slide deck? Does it go up? I'm sorry, I'm not, okay. You've got it here. So it's probably not going to take me 20 minutes because I know that you've also heard from others involved, and I believe you're familiar now with the background. As I mentioned, there were two recommendations that led to the process that I understand we're going to be discussing today. Recommendation 25 regarding implementing a policy regarding just cause dismissals, and 27 introducing amendments to the Public Service Act, giving the Merit Commissioner the opportunity to, or the authority to review dismissal for just cause. And those came into effect June 30th, 2017. The Public Service Agency adopted Human Resource Policy 23, and then the amendments received royal assent in May of 2018. So I am on slide 4 now, and the Human Resource Policy 23 clarified the employer's roles, responsibilities, and procedures with respect to just cause termination, and included 2 checklists to help make sure that there were, in fact, the procedural fairness that was required when terminating someone for cause. Both of these checklists refer to receiving and considering legal advice. And specifically, moving on to slide 5, whether there is sufficient background and materials provided to legal counsel, whether the agency obtained a legal opinion regarding the strength of the just cause position for included employees, or confirming that there are sufficient grounds to support the termination for excluded employees. that the legal opinion and background and file material were documented, and that it was provided to the relevant deputy minister in the briefing package when the deputy minister made the decision whether or not to terminate for cause. So the provisions as it relates to included employees have either labor relations specialist or legal counsel providing advice. I can say, as a deputy minister who has reviewed packages, sometimes both. So it's not always just one or the other. And then for excluded employees, a written legal opinion that confirms there are sufficient grounds to support the termination. Moving on to slide 7. The Merit Commissioner is authorized to review the dismissal file that's held by the Public Service Agency. And in their review, it's important, it's statutorily required, that they must not make a determination as to whether or not the dismissal met the legal standard. So it's not a review of the legal advice in any way. Is not open to the commissioner to come to a different conclusion about whether or not the standard for just cause had been met, but rather to make sure that legal advice was obtained and included in the package and obtained, documented, and then included in the package that goes to the decision maker. So where the dismissal, pausing for a second. The legal advice that's in the dismissal file is protected by solicitor-client privilege. And solicitor-client privilege is generally held to be the most sacrosanct privilege that there is. This has been confirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada on a number of occasions. And it's not, access to legal material is not included in the Public Service Agency, or in the Public Service Act for the Merit Commissioner. So there's no statutory right to access the legal advice itself, the content, as opposed to the checklist, which indicates whether or not it was received, documented, and included. That is the same for all other, in my understanding, officers of the legislature. I am not aware of any specific provision that provides the officer of the legislature with the right to obtain the province's legal advice. However, the province is, in various circumstances, including the misfire investigation, willing to provide access on certain terms and conditions on a voluntary basis. And that's often documented in a protocol, as occurred in this case. And so that protocol was signed in March of 2022, and I'm now on slide 9, between the Deputy Attorney General and the then Merit Commissioner. And this involved the disclosure of legal advice. And how that works is the Merit Commissioner sends a request to the Ministry of Attorney General for any legal advice in the file. LSB, Legal Services Branch, undertakes a review of each dismissal file to ensure that legally privileged information is identified as per the protocol. And now I want to say that that legally privileged advice primarily includes solicitor-client privileged information, but may include other statutorily protected information, such as information that's required to be removed under the Child, Family and Community Services Act, the Federal Youth Criminal Justice Act, or any other statutory requirements that require that information to be removed before the file is provided. So LSB reviews and then redacts the legal advice. There is a right to decline to provide the legal advice, and if that decision is made, reasons are provided to the Merit Commissioner. And then 2 forms of the package are sent over to the Merit Commissioner's office. One of which is the package that would include the legal advice, but have redacted any other legally privileged advice. And then the second package is a version that has the legal advice redacted as well. And the reason for that second package is so that the Merit Commissioner's office can have a copy of the redacted file, because under the protocol, once they've finished reviewing the advice, it has to be destroyed or returned in accordance with that protocol, with the exception of any notes undertaken by the Merit Commissioner's legal counsel, because the Legal Professions Act requires that lawyers keep a certain level of documentation. So there's a carve out in the protocol to make sure that the lawyers can fulfill their obligations under the Legal Professions Act. And that concludes my presentation. I am happy to answer or attempt to answer any questions the members may have.
Questions, members?
Thanks for coming, folks. Friday of a long weekend. And thanks for explaining and reminding us of the role the AG's ministry plays as advisors to ministries in the investigative process. So here's my, if I can ask this question in a logical way. You've made the point about the privileged nature of the documentation, but the protocol that allows for the sharing of opinion-related information. Presumably, part of the rationale for that is, although the Merit Commissioner looks at process as opposed to the decision, if he were confronted by decisions, a decision that was at odds with the advice that had been provided to the ministry, that might prompt the Merit Commissioner to look more closely at that process. So I suppose from that point of view, having access to the opinion, to the advice, legal advice is helpful. My question flowing from that, have just cause dismissals, and there's a limited number of them, we've been told. And let's just take the period since the Merit Commissioner has been on task. Have those decisions been challenged or reviewed judicially? Are there any examples of that where an employee has been dismissed for just cause, taken that to the court, and had a finding substituted or had that decision overturned? Are you aware of any? Here's why I'm asking. If that were to be happening with any regularity, then the committee might say, you might want to have examine the nature of the advice that's being given on more closely. Conversely, if it's not happening, or if the decisions are being upheld by the courts, then or maybe there aren't any. Maybe there haven't been any examples of employees who have been dismissed for cause taking the matter to the courts. I don't know.
I'm not aware of any court decisions. There has been arbitrations, so for included employees that have gone forward. Those reviews all occur before the Merit Commissioner commences the file.
All right. Well, let's. And I don't want to pin you down on numbers because I didn't warn you. I was going to ask the question, but any sense as part of the arbitration process the order of magnitude for when, in that subset, decisions are overturned?
I can answer the question, actually. There are very few cases that go to full arbitration. I think there might be one or two decisions. I'd have to go look them up. I can't actually think of it right off the top of my head. There may be one or two that went to a full arbitration, and there would be an award, a public award on it.
And those would be included?
Those would be included employees.
Included
Yeah,
personnel.
there's been
as
no
opposed-
court cases.
Okay. And those would have been just cause dismissals?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Any other comments or question? Sure, Rory?
Thank you for the presentation. This has been interesting, actually, because you've highlighted some parts of the process which I didn't understand, and my understanding of what you're saying is that the statutory provisions are essentially primarily just access to the checklist that is provided. Is that accurate? And so that's a useful piece of information, because looking at that checklist, it's very there's not a lot of detail there, right? It is to go through and say, as you say, has this been obtained and provided?
Sorry, I may have misspoke. I apologize. As far as what I was attempting to say is with respect to the legal advice.
Yeah.
There isn't the statutory right to the advice. There would be the right to look at the checklist, which refers to obtaining and documenting the legal advice. The Merit Commissioner is entitled to the dismissal file under the provisions of the Act. So...
The Merit Commissioner receives a long list of documents from both the investigation file and then the dismissal file, which is the file that's put before a deputy minister, and that's, a huge amount of documents that they would receive because they receive that entire file.
Yes, and we've heard that the amount of work. I guess, anyway, so thank you for the clarification. It's interesting the difference between that protocol and what the legislation provides. It also, I did not realize that, well, anyway, I'll leave it at that. I guess one of the questions is about, I think in an ideal world, all of this information would be part of the review process and everything would be reviewed. In the real world, there's a cost in terms of labor and money to do that. For that redaction process, seems like that is where the bulk of the administrative burden falls in terms of providing that documentation to the Merit Commissioner. Is there a sense, and maybe this is again a question to answer later, is there a sense of how much work that is, or what the range of how much time that takes to be able to provide those two different redacted versions? Is this an enormous amount of work, or is this a moderate amount of work? And I recognize that that's a subjective answer or question.
I would say a lot of it depends on the file. I am sure there are files that are quite time consuming because they've been going on for a very long time. They may have, a number of instances or investigations that have occurred leading up to the termination decision. Others, I think, would be much more straightforward. The review, though, would be required to a large extent, regardless of the solicitor-client piece, because we do have to look for those other statutory privileges that need to make sure that we are in compliance with our obligations on those fronts.
Okay, thank you. So there's no. It seems like there's no simple way to find a reduced labor-involved version of the process to get to that provision of redacted documents.
I will turn it over to Denise, who has much more experience with the actual hands-on process.
Yes. I think the Public Service Agency made a recommendation around this, but, I would say that the package that goes to the deputy minister, it is a comprehensive package that includes the final investigation report and all the pieces, involved with that, and that might be an interesting starting point, would be for the merit commissioner to see that, because what's also provided is all the transcripts of all the interviews, all the audio, often drafts of preparations for those kinds of things. There's all sorts of correspondence around arranging witnesses. I mean, there's hundreds of pages of documents often. So I think that was, it's interesting to separate out, I think, the investigation file itself from the review, the package that goes to the deputy minister, all of which the merit commissioner sees right now.
Yeah, thank you. That's a useful piece of information. And the other question, just for the record, that you answered in your presentation, which I didn't know and is helpful, is the understanding that, at least what I understand you were saying, is that the need to retain that the red line version, I guess it is, right? It is for that legal standard for the merit commissioner. Is that accurate? Because one scenario is, why do we need to have, why does there need to be the retention of any of that documentation, frankly, if the review is done? But I think what you were saying is that needs to be retained by the merit commissioner.
I'm not aware if there's a legal obligation or if that's a policy piece that the merit commissioner decided to do, and we cooperate with it.
So, okay, one further follow-up then. So if the merit, if that is a policy piece, if the merit commissioner didn't need to retain any of that documentation, my understanding is that other statutorily protected information still would need to be redacted prior to it going to the merit commissioner, correct? So the work still has to happen, even if there isn't a retention of that documentation after the fact.
The work would have to happen, but if there was not the requirement to provide a redacted version that removed the legal advice, the redacting portion of the exercise would be more efficient. But the review piece would still be the same.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Any other question? I do have actually one question, and so you said there was a protocol that you enter into in 2022 that involved the red line package, which highlight the information that's legally privileged, right? And then there's also the black line, which is really with that information blacked out. So what led to this kind of protocol being implemented? Did it help the process to streamline, reduce the labor required? And what happened prior to that, prior to this protocol being implemented?
That's a good question, and I probably should have included that in my presentation. So the Act came into force in 2018. The first reviews occurred in 2019, and it was pretty much at that point that the Merit Commissioners Council wrote to the then Deputy Attorney General and said, we would like a protocol. We are aware that there are protocols with other officers of the legislature, and the Merit Commissioner believes that she needs access to this information in order to be able to thoroughly conduct her mandate. And the negotiations about exactly what was disclosed, how it would be disclosed, whether or not it was going to be the legal services branch's entire legal file, or whether it was only going to be the legal advice in the public service agency's file. There were discussions that went on for quite a while. In the meantime, what we came up with was an interim protocol that, subject to any corrections that Denise has, is fairly similar to what there is now. And we called this basically a trial process, in part because before we finalized the protocol, we wanted to see how things worked. So there really was never a time that we had a different process. This started almost immediately. There were some delays in the beginning while we were working out this trial, And then I believe there may have been a few tweaks over time. I cannot remember specifically what they were, but then we ended up signing a protocol that was substantially the same. Again, subject to anything my colleague has to add to that.
It's very similar.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mike, your question?
Just this, in preparing the opinions that Legal Services Branch does for the line ministries, does the ministry of the branch ever experience difficulty or frustration securing the documents and material it requires or the solicitor requires to render that opinion, or is the flow of information pretty good?
And generally, when we're at the stage where a request is made for a legal opinion, the investigation is complete and that file is complete, and therefore that information is available to legal counsel.
So you haven't
And provided.
You don't recall, you haven't encountered any problems or frustrations getting the material that's required to render an opinion?
I've never had that situation, no.
And thank you for your presentation, and you're the last one, and we're going to have a 1 minute break or so, and then we get into our own discussion. Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stick it for online folks.
Okay, sure. We'll give a time, 11:20, in recess until 11:20. Yeah.
Okay. So you're good to call it back to order?
Sure. Well, we call the meeting back to order, and I need a motion to go to a discussion in camera. Ravinder? Okay.
All those in favor?
All those in favor? Yeah. Okay. Opposed? Okay,
So just wait
Good.
till we're back in, there we go.
okay, so this meeting is adjourned.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Yeah, see you guys. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.